Okay, let's talk eeling in the spring. And of course, if we're going to talk eeling in the spring, we got to talk big fish. So, the thing about eeling in the spring is it's definitely one of those things that is, like it is all season long, one of the best ways to catch really big fish. And the springtime is very similar to the fall, is when you're going to have a surplus of big fish moving through. And if you have an understanding of when those big fish will be in your area, that's definitely when you want to start eeling. Now, because I've logged many years of when the fish arrive on Cape Ann, which is my home waters, that's when I know when June 1st rolls around, we're going to have big fish in a few areas on Cape Ann. I know where I'm going to be fishing. I know what tide I'm going to be fishing. I know what moon phase I'm going to be fishing. I have that all pre-planned out before the winter's over. And by the time the spring starts, I have a game plan for every single tide leading up for that first week to 2 weeks of June, when we have a lot of really big bass around and some extremely, like, probably the biggest chance of getting into the biggest bass of your season you'll have all season long. Because in the fall, things are a little more run and gun, bait dependent, but in the spring, there's stuff that seems to just year after year after year stay the exact same. But to break it down and to get it into the things that I've been talking about a lot recently is water temperature, bait, and then obviously the time of year that the fish are coming in. In time of year is relative, because we were talking about spring, which kind of ranges for me on Cape Ann from about May 1st to about the third week of June. I would say is still spring fishing. As soon as you get into like late June, early July, you get into more summer patterns. Depending on how warm the water is will depend on when the spring kind of ends for us. But as far as I'm talking about going and getting the first eels to fish with, I have it kind of patterned down here. So what I really like to do is find where the water's going to be warm and where there's going to be a lot, like a surplus of bait. And so I've always found that sand eels for me tend to be the primary bait fish for the striped bass the really big striped bass when they first show up on Cape Ann. And I've had a few days where I've had very finicky bass to the point that they're not even going to be eating eels. So it kind of comes down to a thing that you gotta know that when they show up, they might be very picky, very finicky, but you will have a shot at them, and your best chance is going to be live eels. And so what I like to do is I like to put myself in these positions to where I'm going to hopefully run into a big fish. And then you kind of have to think about the mindset of a big fish. Yeah, eeling is its own separate thing, but also the first big fish of the season rolling in is also a very important factor to eeling, in my opinion. I would rather not fish with eels, but when I do, I want to make sure that there's big fish around, because then I know I'm not wasting eels. They're not cheap to buy, but they're also a pain in the ass to deal with. So what I like to do is make sure that when I do buy eels, I am going to have a good chance at running into some big fish. So when I first get eels, where I'm going to be looking for the first big fish of the spring is obviously going to be estuaries. And estuaries are just a great place to hold lots of bait. There are certain estuaries that, for me on Cape Ann, that will have sand eels roll into them. But for many other estuaries, you'll have things like herring in there. You'll have things like adult bunker, adult Atlantic menhaden that are in those estuaries. And those are all great, very big bass producing baits. So if you have anything along those lines, you're definitely going to have, and you know when those big fish are going to roll in, you're definitely going to have a good chance at targeting some big bass. So what I like to do is I like to find places where there's a change in bottom structure, and it kind of breaks down to okay, where are those bass going to stage up? So for us on Cape Ann, we have a lot of muddy to sand changes in the estuaries. We have a lot of gravelly, rocky areas that change from gravelly, rocky areas to mud or sand. And those areas where you have those changes in bottom structure are going to hold fish in general and life. So what's going to happen is you'll have sand eels that will congregate around there. You'll have things like little crabs and shrimp and whatever, which is just going to start the whole ecosystem there, and is what's going to get those bass to want to hang out along those bottom structure changes. The other thing I really look for is water that is slower moving off of rips. and choke points. So I'll talk about the choke points first. Choke points are very important because if you think about it, a bass is moving in and out of an estuary. If there's a point in that estuary that is very thin and narrow, generally closer to the mouth of the estuary, that bass will move in between there at some point. So you're probably going to have your better chance of running into a fish in that area than anywhere else. The other thing I really like to look for, as I was saying, is if you have anything from a bowl, which like a deeper depression in the sand, or maybe some boulders that are creating a break in the current. A lot of the time, the really big bass will be sitting right behind there, digesting, catching their breath, because they've been battling the current. They are really good at battling current, and they can hang out in some really good current, but they do like to digest in the estuaries. And as I've been told by a lot of really good fishermen that I really respect, estuaries are like gas stations on a highway. What happens is those bass are going to stop off in those estuaries to feed, warm up, digest, and then continue their migration north. So in the spring, that's 100% one of the best places to run into some really, really big fish. Every year, some of the biggest bass that are caught on Cape Ann are going to be caught out of the estuaries. I always catch some of my biggest bass of the season out of the estuaries in the spring. And so that's why when I'm fishing in the spring with eels, I'm looking for things like that. Another thing I really like to look for, as well as transition points, is really just big tides. And what will happen is with these big tides, especially on the outgoing of those big tides, you'll get all the like crabs and mud minnows and stuff that's in the estuary grass kind of dumping out of the estuary grass. Those big bass will know that those are going to be some easy meals, and around the slack tides will actually be up in the grass right along the bank. Any of those little creek mouths that are kind of cutouts from the estuary, those bass will be swimming around the mouths of those looking for bait. So I always like to cast my eels along those little mouths of bait, of where the bait's going to get flushed out. And then on the flip side of that is finding tides that are very small. So like 8-point tides around us, which are not our bigger tides. So it would be, depending on where you are, it's either going to be whatever your smaller tides are. And what will happen is that will, and it really varies from place to place, and definitely when you're further south and you have smaller tides, this is definitely less of a thing that's going to affect the fish. In fact, probably a bigger tide will help you guys more. But for us, if we have a smaller tide, there's not as much water movement. Those bass will definitely use that as a time to come in and digest food. And so what will happen is they'll almost be frolicking around, and if you can throw a live eel in front of them, a lot of the time you'll get a good chance of getting into some really big fish. And they tend to be kind of schooled up this time of year, so if you find one, you're probably going to find a couple, and that's what comes into like can really be some of those very memorable spring nights of fishing. So as far as the eeling goes, of course I like to fish eels very slow. I like to almost drift my eels when there's some sort of current, so I'm going to cast a little bit up current. I'm going to reel nice and slow, let those eels drift down current, and always maintain tension to the eel, and then wait for that hit. Now, because of circle hooks and everything, you kind of give it a few seconds, let them eat it, but always make sure you're reeling into the fish, not giving them too much time to eat it, because a really big bass will eat a big eel, and even with a circle hook, they will get gut hooked. So make sure you reel into them after only a few seconds of them grabbing the eel. As well as when I'm fishing eels, I like to use more moderate action rods. And the reason for that being, when the bass grabs the eel, they can pull a little bit on the rod, and the rod's not going to pull that eel out of their mouth, and that is very important. For estuaries, I like to use rods that are about 9 foot, because you don't need something super long to reach a lot of the different spots that those bass are going to be in. Estuaries are not huge. I can get away with fishing a lot of lighter tackle. There's also, depending on where you are and what the bottom structure is, a lot of the time there'll be less sharp objects for those fish to break you off on. So what I like to do is make sure I'm fishing like lighter gear to be more sensitive and more subtle with my presentation in the water. If I can get away with fishing something like 30-pound braid to maybe a 40-pound leader or a 30-pound leader, depending on the bottom structure, I will definitely do that. If there are sharp rocks under the water, or there's mussel beds or something that you're worried about getting cut off on, having like a 40-50 pound leader is not a crazy thing to do, or maybe even like a bigger reel. I like to fish 100 size reels in estuaries, but you can also fish 150, 200 depending on what the bottom structure is. If you guys enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.